about is to consider or to give some reflections on what counts as evidence in their particular disciplinary domain from the perspective of their empirical work, whether it's clinical work, whether it is sociological, whatever the kind of methodological modality that they most commonly use. What counts as data? How is that evidence assessed as valuable, as compelling, as worthwhile, as some way useful to the academic project in which they are engaged? So in this first round, we're inviting our speakers to kind of both introduce, I guess, what they do, the disciplinary orientation that they take, and the kinds of research that they do from the perspective of the question of evidence and data. So we would like to propose that our speakers kind of speak in the same order each time, just so that we can all keep track of it. And because Thema is unfortunately not with us, we presume something came up that prevented her signing on, which is a great pity, but nevertheless, we will continue. So we can't begin with Thema. So the next person on the list is Professor Laila Asmal. So I will invite you, Laila, to kick us off. I know it is not always easy being the first person to get a conversation started, but please do go ahead. We have 3 minutes for you, and I'll give you a 30-second ping just before your time is up.
Sure. Okay, thank you. So the question, what counts as compelling evidence? It's a difficult one in psychiatry, because psychiatry is a branch of medicine. I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a clinician, so I'm a medical doctor like all psychiatrists, but I'm also a researcher. And psychiatry specifically focuses on the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of mental disorders. And it's regarded as a classically scientific field. So when we talk about science, I think it's worth taking a step back and just reflecting on what is evidence in science and what is the scientific process. So the scientific process of generating evidence involves systematically approaching knowledge. And then once you systematically approach the knowledge, you formulate a hypothesis. And then you gather your evidence to test the hypothesis. Along the way, you address your bias. And then ideally, you would refine your knowledge by retesting and looking at different samples in different populations and correcting your original hypothesis and honing it. So the premise of science is that you should be, and the generation of evidence in science is it's meant to be unbiased and impartial. And the evidence that is generated should be generated in a systematic way and should be able to be replicated. And as a mentor once said to me, science is a competition of ideas, not of people. So, I mean, this is all hugely important because the evidence that we generate needs to be trusted by society. So Western medicine, if we're talking specifically about Western medicine, which is largely the frame I work in, is the dominant frame internationally in many ways in terms of kind of what is accessible to people, largely. It should really be seen as society as an honest attempt by scientists to describe the world accurately and without bias. However, after all of this lovely kind of explanation of what science is, the reality is, and especially for something like psychiatry, I mean, anybody who knows anything about psychiatry would know that Jung and Freud did not employ the scientific method. And a lot of therapy that's been used today does not employ the scientific method, but is hugely respected and widely practiced and has been hugely helpful for a lot of people. So there's that kind of social science and therapeutic approach to psychiatry And then there's the more biological scientific approach to psychiatry, where there's been a lot of argument that the biological approach has a lot of biases within. So psychiatry, when it comes to generating evidence, has this push and pull between the social and biological sciences and how we need to balance that. And so our evidence is really essentially a balance between those different approaches and the biases inherent within them. I'll stop there.
Perfectly timed. Thank you so much, Laila. So our next speaker is Linsey McGoey. So your chance to contribute starts now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mehita, and thank you to Anna and Fumani for the organizing of this. So the question was very interesting to ask us to think about what counts as evidence in our own disciplines. And I realized immediately I had a challenge there, because I, as a sociologist and a qualitative sociologist, and also a social theorist, one of the objects that I study, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a minute, is how evidence is produced and how different political and social and economic actors use evidence in order to meet different ends. So I study sort of evidentiary regimes in practice and the types of power and domination that are bound up in that. But that's a different question than the question of what is convincing evidence in your own discipline. So I wasn't sure if the organizers wanted me to talk about what sociologists see as convincing evidence, or what I study, which is, for example, what economists hold up to be convincing evidence in different areas of social life, or what philanthropists hold up to be evidence of the success or lack thereof of their own giving practices. So I thought I'd briefly try to talk about both and link them together. So in my field, I would say in ways we are pretty ecumenical when it comes to evidence in comparison to other disciplines, in that sociologists, and especially European sociologists compared to the States, where I think things are a bit more positivist in the States, and certain types of quantitative evidence are really at the top of knowledge hierarchies. And if you've got big data sets, you're seen as much more convincing than sociologists who study experiences or who draw more on qualitative evidence or social theory. But I'd say in the UK, there's a little bit more openness to qualitative data being convincing. But even then, there are limits. And I'll try to speak about those limits in just my brief last minute while linking it to my overarching interest in ignorance studies. So this term ignorance studies is used to talk about the ways that often the absence of evidence can be a political goal for different actors who don't want to have to basically be accountable for the negative effect that their actions can have on different groups. So in the past, often people saw power and knowledge as very linked. So the more that a state knew about different subjects, the more they could control them and potentially dominate them. So the goal of legibility, as James Scott talks about, it was a key goal of governing actors, knowing more about subjects through different types of census taking, for example, often to be able to punish different groups more for different types of activity that were apparent. But what we in ignorance studies specialism say is that often not knowing is also useful, and it can be a key goal of actors. But trying to convince journal editors that that was the case was very hard for me, because when I first tried to publish on this, people would say, what evidence do you have that people are strategically ignoring inconvenient information? And I would say, well, the absence of a fact is the evidence itself. And that was not very palatable, especially to US journal editors, which I'll come back to when it's my chance again to speak. But I hope I've managed to talk a little bit about the fact that although we claim to be quite open to different types of evidence, actually certain types of non-knowledge are harder to convince. And that is why they're quite useful for different groups, ironically.
Thank you. What a fascinating starting point. So thank you for that. And our next speaker's turn is Amer. So over to you, Amer.
Hi, thanks so much to Anna and Mehita for inviting me and organising this session, and for Mani as well for your work on the tech and organisation. I'm really nicely placed here after Linsey, actually, as a cultural and political geographer, because we share that social science kind of background. And my area of research over the last decade has been looking at the ongoing impacts of colonialism and how they're intersecting with the impacts of climate change in frontline communities in the Pacific. And so as a cultural and social geographer working in the area of environment and climate change, what is really used within our discipline is a kind of multiple scalar modality that brings together theoretical, quantitative, and qualitative research together to kind of create a more holistic approach. This is contentious. This does not always happen. A lot of people, as Linsey was saying, you know, I am in the UK, and there's still, at least in the climate area, a heavy concentration on quantitative data sets. So pulling data from different kinds of sensing technologies around the world to collate what is understood as, you know, the impact of climate change, the climate data. And what I really bring into my work, which I think a lot of geographers do, is ethnographic work around this as well, because what we really see is that climate change is not a one-size-fits-all thing. You know, there are really differential impacts happening in different places, and people's experiences of those impacts also can contradict what the quantitative data is saying. So for instance, in some of the work that I've done with people on the island of Nauru, people's anecdotal stories and memories and experiences sit in really sharp contrast to what the data that is gathered through sensors is actually saying. So people's lived experiences of what they're experiencing is very different to what scientists are saying is happening. And so the question of compelling evidence becomes really messy in this kind of scenario, because you have people that are kind of saying, well, we need to found what we're saying on, you know, this kind of long range global data that we're collecting. And then there are other people that are arguing, well, also ethnographic evidence counts here as well, you know, so we really have to bring this in together. Another thing that is really oftentimes missing from the quantitative data are the different ways that people are responding to climate impacts, and also in some cases, you know, engaging in activities that might kind of trouble what the sensors are picking up. So for instance, in places like, you know, Fiji or Papua New Guinea, where people are detonating dynamite within their own coral reefs to kind of access fish and things like that, that is having an impact that the quantitative kind of data resources can't actually pick up on. So it's really an issue, I think, in geography in this kind of work to bring those different forms together and to try to find a way to balance them to see more nuanced perspectives. So yeah, it's a really tricky thing to answer within my discipline.
Thank you so much, Amer. I'm already so thrilled by all the contributions being made. So Alexander, it is your turn next. Please do go ahead.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. And Mehita, Anna, thanks for having me. And I'm definitely falling more here on the side of Amer and Linsey with some of the similar issues. So I have a background, or I have a PhD in social anthropology. I end up doing a lot more with geography, and I would define myself more as a political ecologist. And I think what's really maybe important to this is the understanding that objectivity is impossible. You know, so this idea that, and obviously this goes back to Michel Foucault and the order of things, in terms of really looking at how epistemologies and the ways we look at the world are highly constructed in terms of whatever humans are doing is going to always have some kind of bias or subjectivity. And so this is what's really scary right now for me, is actually how what's being passed off as objective, whether it's in quantitative data models or even what data is being collected, is highly concerning in terms of what's being claimed as objective and normal. And it's not at all. But as a political ecologist, you know, this comes out of actually responding to ecology that tried to claim to be objective, engaging in kind of, doing the best it can through being objective and all this and that. But political ecology says, no, this is completely subjective. This is political. And political ecology, with the kind of off the cuff definition, is, you know, it's looking at the political and the ecology and the ecology and the political. But in terms of on the ground stuff, what is compelling evidence? I mean, before I get into some of the specifics, related to ethnography and participant observation and interviewing and things like this, what is compelling when we live in a system that more or less is completely unresponsive to social scientists, especially, but scientists in general, especially in matters of ecological catastrophe or social crisis, often called climate crisis, and so on and so forth. But at least, to get down and dirty to it, but I mean, what counts? I mean, really just this idea of what is compelling evidence, none of it really, it doesn't hold, it seems like whoever's got the most money who will pay things off and keep the train and the existing system going in the way that it's supposed to, like that's compelling evidence. But at least in my discipline, or at least in the little ghettos that academia creates that we fight over to give kind of corporations power through publishing and get libraries plundered with, which hopefully we'll talk about more, is to really stress. So really, where does evidence come from? So for me, it's being there, being on the ground, tasting, smelling, eating, seeing some of the, oh wow, I already got 30 seconds. But yeah, so being there, the duration of time, how long you're there, the interviews, how you're actually triangulating those interviews with different kind of data from people or news sources or different places, even though some of those newspapers are going to be all crooked. And then also, and direct participation, being a part of it. And then of course, official documentation, those stamps still have a way to kind of make evidence. But we'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Apologies that our fifth and final speaker is not here. And I'm sure she would have had something to contribute from the quantitative perspective. I'm not surprised that already our debate is taking us into the terrain of epistemology and into the terrain of thinking between and with and beyond this kind of quantitative qualitative divide. So with those starting observations in our first round, I shall now hand over to my dear colleague, Anna, to take us into the next round of the discussion.
Okay, great. So also because our quant representatives are now outnumbered on our roundtable, if anyone in the audience does come from a quant perspective, please feel free to add some other insights that you might have. I mean, this is for everybody, but we are conscious that we had meant to have more of a mix than we now have. So please do feel free to add things from your perspective. I've seen some of my colleagues pop in who I know have some interesting methodological approaches. So please don't be shy in the chat. Our second question that we have asked our speakers to prepare is, in your experience, how has or can particular forms of evidence be used as an instrument of as an instrument of power? So in this first in round two, we are thinking about power kind of from the top down, which I think Xander just gave us a nice intro to what we mean by top down power. So yes, so I'll go back up to the top of the list and we'll turn to Laila.
Okay, great, thank you. So I so appreciate what Alexander said, and I'd also like to speak to what Linsey and I were talking about. I'm in a field that has been dominated by a biological approach over the past 40 years or so, which has largely been quantitative. And this is problematic, and I'm speaking from a low middle income country perspective. This has been problematic for a number of reasons. I mean, it's entering the millennium, 90% of the global population lives in low middle income countries, but only 5% of our mental health research in the high impact journals, the ones that actually matter in terms of change and practice, only 5% of the evidence comes from low middle income countries. And I think that really speaks to the bias towards quantitative research, and also the bias that is inherent in science and in the approaches that scientists use within science that goes largely unrecognized. maybe more so recently, but largely unrecognized. So, you know, at a very basic level, quantitative research is expensive. It's biologically based, often has sophisticated analyses. It's requires a fair amount of technical know-how, statisticians, grant writers, because it's so expensive. And it's really gamified towards high-income countries. And if you're going to try and do something like that in a low-income country, you are going to end up with small projects and small sample size or qualitative study that's going to be published in a low-income journal that's not really regarded as good medical science. I mean, I'm being reductionistic, but it's certainly not going to hit the level as of a large quantitative study. And so what you end up having is that, for example, in Africa, you have African collaborators linking with high-income countries, and then African partners speak about data, being just data collectors, not having a realistic leadership part. The high-income country prioritizes what research questions are asked, the approach of the project, and the African collaborators are sidelined in the collaborations. And it's not infrequent, and I've been part of it, where a high-income country collaborator kind of swoops in, comes on a fancy plane, and makes these kind of broad recommendations, and it's the low-income investigator that needs to do the work on the ground. And so this is an accepted and unspoken about status quo, because if you do speak about it, the leverage is so little as a low-income country scientist, when only 5% of the high impact journal articles get published from your countries. You kind of have to toe the line, otherwise you're just not going to get there. It's high stakes to be a whistleblower or to talk about systemic inequality, because the journal editors, the conference organizers, and the people who have access to a lot of the journals, because these journals are expensive, are all within the system, the bias within the system. So it's really hard to stand up and speak out about it. There was an interesting study that was done, which is a really classically good scientific study, where they looked at tuberculosis treatment amongst, and it was done in a really well done randomized controlled trial, and they had English clinicians to review the study, and they didn't expose or explain where the scientists came from, and the English clinicians rated the study as very highly. And when they randomly assigned the publication source, so whether it was a high-income country or a low-income country authorship, the clinicians would recommend the article differently. So if the study was found to be from a high-income country, the clinician would find it more relevant and would recommend the finding to their peers. If the study was found to come from a low-income country, the same science, the exact same science around tuberculosis treatment, and they also did one on cholesterol treatment, and solid science, the recommendations were completely different. Lower level ratings of relevance, lower peer recommendations. And obviously this has an impact on, besides the scientific, the trajectory of the scientists as to whether they're going to get more grants and publications and get invited to conferences and speakers, etc. But it also has a implication on knowledge translation and accessibility to knowledge. Not sure how much of time I have left. But it's these inherent biases that also then translate to grant applications and whether you're going to be able to successfully get a grant. So your ability to get a grant, if you look at one of the big medical scientific grant agencies, the National Institute of Health, the biggest recipients of grants, the recipients do not speak to the health needs of the population, as you see from the unmet needs of America. NIH is American. The people who get the grants are people who've received grants before. And the people who allocate the grants are people that come from inherited privilege. So science in itself may be limited in terms of its biases, but the actual workings of science is a different story. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing the richness of that experience and overview. So it's also particularly resonating because I'm in the middle of writing my first NIHR grant as someone who is not coming from the health world. And let's just say it's been very eye-opening. So over to Linsey next.
Thank you. So how is evidence used as an instrument of power in some of the things I look at? Well, I think I'll try to relate my response to Laila's incredibly rich discussion by talking about one of the actors, the social actors I've studied in the past, is the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I carried out a long-term study of this philanthropic institution before there was a wave of recent conspiracy theories that emerged around Bill Gates and the perception that he was directly potentially trying to harm people through different sorts of actions surrounding vaccine production. So I want to speak about sort of how evidence can be used in unintended ways beyond those that you mean to protect and how people can seek to have accountability for that. But the reason why I was critically concerned about the Gates Foundation is because I felt that no one was talking that extensively about one of the main concerns that Laila just raised, which is that when the Gates Foundation got involved in global health funding, they directed the vast majority of their research grants towards recipients who were in so-called first world or developed nations. So it tended to be Ivy League recipients at some of the most well-endowed, lucrative institutions in the West who got all the money. And I suggested that that was hugely unjust. I wasn't the sole person suggesting this. Many people were, but if they tried to speak up about it, they were then at risk of losing potential funds from the institution itself. So it was very hard to speak truth to power about some of the inequities that were inherent in the Gates Foundation's funding model. And if you ask the foundation leaders themselves, and they were eventually pressed about that, Gates would give an answer that was very similar to what Laila described one of her mentors saying to her, which is that science should be a competition of ideas and not people. And so the response from the Gates Foundation would be, we fund the best ideas, and they tend to be at some of the most cutting edge research institutions, which just happens to be in the West, okay? So they would say, we're not trying to pick winners, but we are following the science and funding the most cutting edge science, not realizing that they are replicating the very power imbalances that they proclaimed to be trying to ameliorate through their philanthropy. So if they say they wanted to end world inequality, which they claim to want to do, then logically they should be trying to enhance research and development capacity in poor nations and not undermining it through compounding existent inequalities as they were doing. And as much as people tried, and many people in the global South tried to make this clear to the Gates Foundation over the years, it has largely fallen on deaf ears. They have not been interested in listening to that critique. So I think our critiques of the Gates Foundation were valid, but unintentionally, they also fueled a lot of extremist perspectives on philanthropic activities in general and led to the perception that essentially there are shadowy pockets of people who are trying to control world events in ways that tended to respond to very problematic anti-Semitic and other types of tropes that can be very dangerous and are dangerous at a time when different types of hate crime are growing. So in a counterproductive way, I worry that my own work on ignorance studies has an obvious sort of conspiratorial logic to it, because it suggests that some of the most important types of power are not visible to certain actors. So when you start to talk about invisible power, you lend credence to conspiracy theories that sense something is awry with global health politics or with world politics, but can't quite put their finger on what. And so it leads to a lot of speculation. And I think that speculation is necessary in some ways, but it can lead to extremist reactions, which can fuel the very violence and inequality that I'm interested in trying to combat and to challenge. So the ways that my own evidence has been used as a tool of division in society, and I know that some of my own critical concerns about the Gates Foundation have been used that way by different right-wing actors, is concerning to me. So evidence is not something that you can ever fully or should seek to have control over, but that's a reality that you have to try to be cognizant of when your evidence base circulates in the world in ways that you're not always happy about yourself.
Again, thank you so much for sharing candidly, because I think we're getting some really rich insights about the realities of this work. So over to Amer.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, it's such a delight to come after Linsey and Laila. Honestly, it's like such a fantastic kind of trajectory. And I wanted to pick up a bit on what Laila was saying in terms of the way that quantitative data is collected, and to kind of expand on that a little bit in terms of like the climate research on the Pacific and the ways that qualitative data, like ethnographic data, kind of faces some of the same pitfalls and some of the same concerns, and is also used as an instrument of power. So, you know, I mean, as I was saying before, like in my field, like we use both, right? And the data sets are presented as objective, and there really isn't all of that much work being done about how and why the data is produced. So how it's generalized despite local differences, where it's collected from, and very importantly as well, the geopolitical relationship to this. So, you know, a lot of researchers in this space, particularly in the Pacific, and I'm sure elsewhere in other frontline communities as well, turn to ethnographic data to kind of try to offset some of these issues, right? But one of the things, like what Laila was talking about, what is very rarely kind of interrogated in the Pacific climate space, and I'm talking specifically about researchers coming from outside the Pacific, so non-Pacific, predominantly white, Australian and European and American researchers coming into the region to talk about climate change. There's not really all of that much conversation. I mean, there is in a kind of a generalized disciplinary sense, but about who is asking the questions, even how are the questions phrased, what language are the questions placed into, and very importantly as well, who chooses the participants, how do researchers come into a place to conduct ethnographic work, what kinds of passageways do they go through in terms of research permits, working with governments, working with different kinds of organizations, and how are those organizations funded as well? Are those organizations that are funded by foreign NGOs, foreign governments, and foreign corporations? Are they grassroots organizations? Who actually is worked with in this space? So in Australia and in the UK, as a person who is a recipient of funding in both places to do this kind of work, what is very, very clear are the ways that funding is allocated, as Laila was saying, to Western and white researchers who are coming from outside. And the way that those funding grants are written have to be very much aligned with the local government's ideological principles and interests at that time. So in Australia, there's a very strong push on public-private partnerships and industry connections. And so what this really does is force researchers, you know, when thinking about the ethnography that they're going to do, is force them into framing the research and framing the way that the research is conducted down to the very questions that get asked, the way that these questions are written up, up about, and the kinds of evidence that is taken from the questions, and this includes like the research relationships that people build, is very much framed through these externally imposed interests and partnerships and ideological kinds of purposes, because otherwise your research does not get funded. So that is a really massive thing to kind of come into an ethnographic work carrying, and it deeply shapes who gets included in ethnographic research, who gets asked. In my experience, if you're working with governments, there are going to be government connections that say you can research this person, you can research that person, you can speak to this person, you can speak to that person, right? So those research relationships are already from the outset completely contextual and very much biased. And there is still this claim that ethnographic research, is kind of moving away from some of those generalizations that qualitative research kind of does, but there's still the same problems when the same people get asked questions by researchers over and over again. There's this funneling in of a particular kind of narrative through those externally imposed interests as well. And they're not just externally imposed, they're also internally imposed. This is the kind of research environment that we are all a part of, contributing to and re-perpetuating constantly. So I think this is a really important thing to think about. I would not put ethnographic or like qualitative and quantitative research, as opposed to one another at all. In the climate space, they completely feed into one another. And I think that the way that it is used as an instrument of power, the way that particular people get asked particular questions to perpetuate particular kinds of narratives that are lucrative and useful for researchers and the governments who are funding those research projects, is a really important thing to think about as well. But I'll leave it there.
I'm up.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes, so rich. And again, thank you for sharing from your own experiences as well. So over to you, Alexander.
Yeah, no, this is good. I like where this is going. We're getting there. I appreciate the words from everyone, and I want to relate to them, and just really even from the beginning with Laila. I mean, it's a class system, and it's a global class system that is deeply racialized, and it's it's kind of crazy what even props up the university and academic knowledge production at this point. Like really, it just comes down to hunger, debt, kids, and addiction and dependency on books and all sorts of other things that I'm surprised. Yeah, I'm really surprised there isn't more being done to really radically reshape these things. But yeah, and Amer and everyone's, and Linsey, you're talking and raising such fundamentally important questions that I feel like are constantly swept under the carpet and not addressed. And I have so many concerns and issues that resonates with me. But to try to answer the question, I've worked in some different durations, 9 environmental conflicts related to infrastructural development, often with low carbon infrastructures, often wrongly called renewable energy, often with wind or energy infrastructure, also mines, coal, copper, lithium recently. So I've worked in a lot of environmental conflicts. I've definitely wedded myself and have been close and prioritized the voice of autonomous or insurrectionary kind of fighters, whether indigenous, farmers, or, autonomous of some type. And in terms of what I would describe my whole career being dedicated for generating knowledge to actually protect habitats, the waters, the trees, the soil, and to kind of really provide an overview of what's often hidden by companies in terms of their financial flows, or really specifically their strategies and tactics used to divide and conquer communities through social development, through green rhetoric, through media advertisement, or through the different kind of repressive strategies between riot police or assassination and things like this. And I feel like that's a lot of all a researcher can really do, is to generate the best kind of information and knowledge that is trying to uncover what powers are trying to hide. And there's a lot of other things you can do in support of knowledge to actually support ecologies and people. But, how does this work as an instrument? I guess I don't really believe in speaking truth to power, as the story goes, as the saying goes. I don't think that works. I think power is well aware what it's doing, what its objectives are, and it's not really, even if it doesn't know, it's not particularly concerned with the harm that it causes. But I am really concerned with actually speaking to people and to kind of spread these things. But unfortunately, I feel like at best with a lot of my work and other people like me, we use the lens of counterinsurgency warfare to actually apply to peacetime scenarios and to actually understand environmental conflicts. But a lot of what this has done has just generated new bureaucracies, new caveats. Corporate social responsibility has turned into environmental government standards of this type, where free prior informed consent that aren't legally binding and that really are changing definitions. So I feel that from a top-down approach, a lot of the knowledge that I generate is actually just creating more procedures and just adding on and creating caveats to continue the existing by different means, or just with a new bureaucratic arm or committee to check a box and to sign this, despite the endless hours of comments and answers where people are fighting and rejecting these things. So I don't feel so positive about that. But maybe to relate to Linsey, I've done a lot. I'm someone who I say that, we need to stop using the word renewable energy. It doesn't exist. We can call it low carbon infrastructures. We can call it lower carbon infrastructures. We call it wind generation, wind extraction, solar, hydrological extraction. There's ways we can be more specific. But to call it renewable is to completely ignore the reality of the impacts and the situations, and also a criteria of trying to understand what is sustainable or renewable. But what happens, as I said, I've worked in coal mining, I've worked in copper mining, I'm not trying to pick sides, but I've seen my work also used by different kind of hydrocarbon sectors, or some types of advocates in there trying to use my work to actually support hydrocarbon extraction. And the key thing for me that I stress to really cut through this is that everything is based on hydrocarbons right now. Everything has a complete supply chain. So there isn't these so-called renewables versus fossil fuels. That's not how industrial supply chains work. Not to mention the crazy accounting procedures that justify these things with national borders, even how carbon accounting's kind of taken up. But I imagine I'll be going over my time soon. But yeah, I just can't stress enough that the amount of issues and the way that research is being kind of played off as objective, and just the non-responsiveness of not only our own departments, but universities, and of course, public policy with very serious issues. And really, I go so far as to say is not a single government is taking environmental or climate policy seriously and really trying to understand what the problems are.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, I think that Thema has joined us, been able to join us. So I'm just going to take a moment to get her set up as a roundtable participant. It's great that so many of you are here, but a little challenging to now find her. All right.
Perhaps Hermione can help us.
I've got you. Yes. Okay, great. Okay, Thema. So let us know if I think we'll just have a little introduce you interlude again and tell you where we are in the dialogue, and then see if we can have you come in. You should be able to now. I've just made you a co-host to see if your video is now working.
Okay, great. Can you all hear me?
We can.
Lovely.
Okay, I'm going to spotlight. Oh, someone's done it for me. Fantastic. Okay, so
Thank you.
We had done round. So again, this is. Oh, we've lost you again.
No.
Oh, you're there.
Sorry.
Okay. No worries. So I'll just reintroduce you. So this is Thema Monroe-White, the academic director of the Campbell Center for Data Analytics, with expertise, among other things, in racial equity and STEM. We are on round 2, and just coming to the end of it, so it's a great time if it's, I realize, impromptu for you, but to have your voice on that. And feel free if you want to weave in a little introduction to who you are that would have been in round 1 to your answer here. So this was the question about how forms of evidence are used as instruments of power.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, so I apologize. I thought I had the time right, but I might have been a little late. But this is I really love the questions overall, and excited to be a part of this conversation. So, in fact, I'll tell you, I was just in a meeting yesterday with some folks from the National Science Foundation, which is our primary funding agency for federal funding on science and technology research. And we had a similar discussion in terms of what is evidence? How do we justify claims? And so I was like, this is such a timely workshop and gathering. So power. So one of the things that is for me very prevalent in the US context, and I won't go into more of my background, but yes, I study race and STEM and racial equity issues in STEM, and particularly I've been interested in data science, data analytics, and artificial intelligence, and why who we are shapes what we know and what we produce in those fields, right? So your racialized and gendered identity, among other identities, is what drives the kinds of questions that you ask, the topics that you express interest in, at least as we're finding in our research. And how I see that manifest with respect to power is like power is often used to manipulate. So in the scholarly publication space, which is where I'm going to really ground this conversation or this particular set of comments, what I've seen is that the scholarly publication landscape benefits and amplifies and showcases topics, questions that relate mostly to the majoritarian view of the world. That is a very hegemonic view, mostly white male. Now, we did is we matched this to author identity to topic space. And we did this for one of our studies. I'm sorry, I don't have the link in front of me, but it's a PNAS piece called Intersectional Inequalities in Science. And in that piece, what we found is that author race and gender identity map very closely to the topics that they study. And even when you hold for discipline, right, in the same discipline, same topics as one another, that say, for example, I, as a Black woman, if I were to produce a paper or a series of papers on the same topic, right, same keywords as a white male in the same journal, my paper would be cited less on average, right? So when we think about how power manifests, how does it show up in scholarly literature, in science? It shows up in a very clearly, I call it eugenics framing. It's like the eugenics map. If you all are not familiar with eugenics, it was this racial categorization of the races, categorization of people across the globe, again, developed by a very narrow segment of the population to highlight and amplify the position of a very narrow segment of the population, namely white men, white women. You know, it was very stratified, down, 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 literally, to Black women, Indigenous women, right at the bottom. It was always male first, always women second, right, within each of these categorizations. And so we see this actually in manifesting in terms of citation counts, right, and recognition of who is an owner, like who has knowledge and who is able to, And so who can we attribute to actually be an expert in a field, right? There's always this person and maybe this person, but not really, right? There's this constant stratification. So this has severe implications, particularly for faculty who tend to be, right, the authors of this work. And even if you make it to the top tier institutions, this is work that's currently under review. We expanded on this initial study to look at institutional affiliation, to say, okay, let's say that you've made it to the higher echelons of your field. You are at the most prestigious, right, institutions, a Harvard, right, a Yale, you're at the top tier. If you are, let's say again, let's say a Latinx woman, right? And you've made it and you're publishing on the same topic in the same discipline as your colleagues, lo and behold, you still remain undercited. And any difference that you might have experienced between being at a lower ranked institution and that higher ranked institution is dampened because of your gender and race and ethnicity identity. So even when you make it to the top, you're not benefiting the same. You're not experiencing the gains in the same way. So that's how power manifests. Power manifests in a structural, very structural way that maintains this structure throughout time. This was over a 10-year period we looked at. We're expanding this study. But we tried for the life of us to find a way that this did not show up, right? In to say, oh, okay, well, when you make it to the top, then okay, it dissipates, right? Like, okay, then you're starting to see more equal because you've proven yourself. Now you really do care. Because I've gotten those questions before. What if you really just aren't, a real scholar and that's not really your focus? So that's why your scholarship is cited less. You're just not as serious about it. Okay, so you can't tell me someone at Harvard or Yale or something like that is not serious about their scholarship. I shouldn't have to make that defense, but you see what I'm saying? And so we still see these findings. So it's just compounded and compounded. So this is structural. And so when it becomes structural, the onus is not on the author, it's not on the scholar, it's not on the faculty to address the issue. It's systemic. And when it's systemic, there's something else that has to happen at the leadership level to make change. All right, I hope I did not run on too long. Those are my comments on round 2. Thank you again for the fantastic question.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if you were here for that full round, but it fit very well with the other perspectives that we got, while offering another unique take based on your research, which is fantastic. And we've shared it with everyone. And I think I'm going to be teaching it as soon as possible, as that sounds really interesting and such a nice way of concretizing something that I think a lot of us, right, experience, if for those in the audience in academia, right, like we experience this when we're organizing events or when we see events being organized. But it's incredible to have this piece of research like that to help and that makes me think a little, which maybe we'll come back to in Q&A, but about when the power of quant, or the power of quantifying something like that, and how it then becomes evidence, I might want us to return to. So I'll turn over to Mehita, who will lead us for round 3.
I am so enjoying this conversation. Thank you so much to all the colleagues who are here. So in our 3rd round, we've heard a little already about the different ways in which evidence is deployed by structures of power, whether it is economic power, political power, cultural, social power, right? The power exercised by knowledge, capital K, and the different forms of evidence which seem to be in constant tension with one another. Like, I love how Thema put it, how do we justify our claims, right? That's such a simple and concise way to explain what evidence means for the scholarly work that we do. So in our 3rd round, we want to invite our speakers to reflect on how in their own work or in their own disciplines, evidence that they've discovered or constructed through their research has the potential to be integrated into methodologies, forms of practice that can dismantle the kinds of structural inequalities that have been described so well, I think, from all of the different perspectives and all of the different disciplines present in the Zoom room in round 2. So we'll go in the same order again, starting with Laila. So over to you, Laila.
Thanks, Mehita. And I'm glad this is the last question, because I'd like for us to end in a hopeful way. So I've been involved in scientific research for over 15 years, and as a person of color living in a low middle income country, researching schizophrenia, which is very underfunded, I've never been more excited about research being produced. And I think that's because the conversation we're having now is a conversation that's been happening in other spaces, in science, in intersectoral collaborations that I've been involved in. And I think there's a movement happening. And one of the most exciting things that I've borne witness to is the empowering of individuals and communities to be active agents in generating knowledge and shaping research agendas. And this is really challenging in something like schizophrenia, which is what I research, where people often have many challenges to their capacities, their intellectual capacities, their functional capacities, their ability to engage, and that's the nature of their illness. And there's been such an empowerment to bring them to the table. There's a movement happening, and it's also made us take a step back and question our intellectual privilege. And I'd just like to kind of reflect on our conversations over the past hour and how challenging it can be to follow for someone who doesn't have the kind of verbal privilege and intellectual privilege that others may have, and how inaccessible research can be for many people, and this kind of discourse can be for many people. And one of the most hopeful things that I've seen is, if we go back to the NIH grants, which is like the NIH, as we mentioned, is one of the biggest funders for medical research internationally, the biggest funder. And an R01 grant is the pinnacle. And a person with a lived experience of schizophrenia, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia and substance use difficulties as a young adult, is a co-investigator who has recently won a $3 million grant. And the grant, the core of the grant, is looking at the deeper issue of social inequality and structural determinants of schizophrenia. And 10 years ago, this would have been inconceivable. So I'm super hopeful. And I think if we're looking at it from a science perspective, we reflect back on the fact that we have to look at the biases inherent in the practice of science. There was an interesting study a few years ago that analyzed the PhD papers that were produced over 10 years in America across disciplines. And they found that the more underrepresented a person was in terms of gender or race in their discipline, the more likely they are to introduce novel concepts. So in the early 80s, a woman in computer science was more likely to produce something novel in their research than a man. A man in nutrition was more likely to produce something novel compared to a woman. A non-white in sociology would be more likely to produce something novel. A man in psychiatry, less likely to produce something novel. And this is fantastic. It means that diversity, bringing diversity to the table, brings novelty, and it brings better science. Unfortunately, what they found is that if you look at what that translates to, if a team or if the field, for example, computer science has mainly men, although the woman's work is more novel, that novelty doesn't get translated into impact. So it's not taken up for future research, it's not taken up towards policy, it's not implemented. But I think that that's changing. As people recognize the richness of diversity, and I see it in my own research as we are partnering with people with lived experience, as we are taking a step back and listening, as we are questioning our own intellectual privilege and what that brings to the table, as we are creating equal partners in research, we are recognizing that that richness of diversity creates better science. And I'm so hopeful of that. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Laila, for those amazing contributions. We'll move swiftly on to Linsey next, as I'm sure you're all as eager as I am to hear what all of the panelists have to say on this theme.
Thanks. At first, I thought I couldn't conceive of points I could make that would be as hopeful as Laila's, because I am I feel more despair currently about some of the negative implications of efforts to actually improve upon the realities of the inequities that we're dealing with. And those negative implications include some of the unintended effects of criticism that I raised a minute ago. And yet Laila did inspire me to feel more positive, especially at the end when you made that really compelling point about something that is talked about a lot in epistemology and philosophy, which is, sometimes referred to as standpoint epistemology, but it's the idea that seeing things from different perspectives in no way voids the effort to achieve objectivity, but actually strives towards more possibility of it, because you start to correct for the blind spots of those who only see life through a very narrow perspective based by their own cultural privileges or racial privileges or class privileges in the past. So this is not the absence of objectivity, it's actually striving towards a better definition or reality of it. And that said, I see constantly, the higher I get in my own field, I'm the incoming head of department, I've just been shortlisting for job candidates, the reality of how often lip service towards diversity results in the exact opposite. Because even if you manage to have a more plural field, often I realize, for example, I'll speak candidly about my own institution, we just shortlisted for 2 jobs, and most of our candidates on paper who we shortlisted came from the global south, which in some ways is great. What trajectory did they take to reach us though? They studied at elite institutions in the West, and that gave them the imprimatur of sort of acceptability that then made them more eligible for us. It guaranteed to us that they had the linguistic fluency to speak with our often very poor students at Essex. We have at Essex it's a disadvantaged county in the United States. Our students often come to us as first generation students. They struggle with things like sometimes even the sophistication of their own levels of literacy. So we know that language issues are a reality we have to grapple with, and communication amongst our staff is a priority. And the imprimatur of studying at an elite English university often gives that candidate that leg up. So let's be realistic about it. The so-called effort towards diversity leads to class biases that tends to privilege people coming to us from poorer regions who are at the top of the class hierarchies in their own nations. And even to speak of that is a taboo, because it's admitting that you look for these type of characteristics. So I think the only hopefulness that I see right now is 2 things. And one of them sort of takes on board Thema's very compelling presentation, but actually tries to play devil's advocate for a bit, because what Thema is faced with on trying to rationalize the excellence of the research of people of color at Harvard or Yale, she said, well, you're not going to tell me someone that Harvard and Yale is not serious about their research. Well, that's true, but we have to challenge the idea that they know more because they are at Harvard or Yale. So we have to, at the same time, validate the importance of people of different racialized backgrounds. We have to advocate for full access and opportunity and a destabilizing of the people who have white privilege or class privilege, and to push them off the pedestal without amplifying the voices of other elite actors who reach those positions, because that amplification then rationalizes the false belief that somehow knowledge at Harvard or Yale is sacrosanct when it's not. Like, I think Steven Pinker is not a serious person, and he is at Harvard, and he makes very problematic claims about the idea that we are living better than we ever have in the West today because of some of the great insights of white men who lived before Pinker. I kind of dislike and disdain that perspective, and to do so, I have to point out that Pinker might be at Harvard, but he's very much misguided in some of his assumptions of his own authority to speak fully or with a solid evidence base to the claims that he makes. So we have to, I think, and this speaks to something Alexander pointed to, I think we have to really address and not speak truth to power, because I agree power doesn't care, but not be afraid for the consequences that face us when we speak honestly about the fact that certain achievements when it comes to an effort towards plurality will have unintended effects. And we can speak honestly about those effects without then that honesty being an apologetics for the status quo. The status quo needs to change, but it will change in ways that actually will be imperfect and that lead us to have a necessity for compromise that I think will be a word that needs to come to the forefront almost as the new radicalism. Compromise is a type of radicalism, especially at a time when the political spectrum is divided by such proclamations of achieving a certain type of purity on one side or the other. So left puritanical purity efforts are a problem. You have to speak one way on every issue or else you're sort of cast out of the political camp. And then right proclamations of purity, someone is a true GOP member and not someone else, are also very problematic because they lead to someone trying to be more extremist than the next person when it comes to their hate politics. These are both problems, and we need to, I think, validate compromise as a good solution and as a radical rather than a sort of defeatist solution.
Thank you so much, Linsey, for those very thought-provoking contributions. So now it is over to Amer, your chance to share.
Hi, thanks so much. Such fantastic things to think with, especially around this issue of what stories and who gets validated to be a knowledge holder and to contribute to discourse in what particular kinds of ways, and these issues around class and social difference, which I'm going to come to in a minute. But I wanted to start this section by saying, I'm not going to speak to my own ethnographic work and that my ethnographic work's been used, but I want to speak to the ways that ethnography is used in Pacific communities to advocate on behalf of themselves and intervene in climate policy and quite importantly here in gender policy as well around climate change through ethnographic kinds of methods. So, in the Pacific, as in many regions of the world, very little work has been done about specifically the climatic and environmental impacts on transgender and queer people, the ways that climate change is impacting those communities specifically. And there's this one fantastic group that I have worked with called Diva for Equality based in Fiji, which is a transgender and queer group that have been conducting ethnographic work within their community for several years now to produce policy reports and to produce information, publicly available information around the kinds of discrimination and oppression that transgender, very specifically transgender, but also queer people are experiencing in terms of access to resources like shelters during disasters and things like that, access to resources like rebuilding, homing, jobs, various kinds of material resources following disasters and crises brought on by climate change. And I think that this is a point where people are kind of community organizations that, yes, DIVA does receive external funding, but is also funded within Fiji as well, where organizations are really relying on the relationships that they have, the long-term community relationships, the kinship networks, the trust that they've built up over a really long amount of time to conduct their own research without the necessity whatsoever of foreign researchers coming in and setting an agenda or contributing in any real kind of way. So I think it's really important to kind of see that these kinds of methods are inevitably and always being used by people within communities that have really no interest in, begging from external investments or external governments, begging for some kind of recognition or some kind of, necessarily even funding to conduct work that is extremely beneficial for their own communities in their own regions without even thinking about, external foreign research partners in that kind of way. So I think that's a really important point to make, is that it's very easy for people to find podcasts, social media, websites, all these sorts of things coming from within frontline Pacific communities where people are doing the organizing themselves and also articulating the ethnographic work that they're doing and the organizing work that they're doing themselves in their own voices and in their own words. And so I think it's always important to look at that, how people are using those methods and communicating that, and to kind of get ahead a bit out of this idea that the university is where everything's produced, because it's absolutely untrue, and I think we would all say that. I think we all know that as well. One of the things that I did want to think about this a little bit, and from what Linsey was saying, is, again, it does also come down at times as well in saying this to what kind of Indigenous knowledge is being feted as the real Indigenous knowledge, what kind of voices are heard within their own governments and within their own communities, and what kinds of things are seen as legitimate. Because of course there are still, like, within those marginalized communities, very, very marginalized sectors and other marginalized actors that are not going to be included even within community research, and so these kinds of issues around class and social difference happens as well in community-based ethnography. You know, like it is going to be a recurring problem that is faced over and over again. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to bring that into the conversation and to say, like, especially within communities working on climate change, you know, I think also a good example is looking at the position of Vanuatu in the push to get the term ecocide recognized by the International Criminal Court, the work that they've been doing with Polly Higgins, who is now sadly passed, on getting ecocide recognized and advocating for different kinds of forms of reparations and forms of legal change, the ways that countries are using the evidence that they're gathering themselves, okay, 30 seconds, to advocate for these kinds of things is a very strong example of how ethnographic evidence is being used as used for empowerment and forms of resistance.
Thank you so much, Amer, for those contributions. So we have two speakers left in this round. Alexander, it is over to you to give us your views on how evidence can contribute to resistance.
All right, beautiful. No, great words from everyone. I really appreciate it. And it really resonates with me what Linsey said, you know, and it's kind of, you know, what constitutes diversity in terms of what's being put there. And I guess as a teacher, it has always been a problem where I was like, you know, we've got the different gender, ethnic quotas going on here, but somehow I feel like they're all from the same gated community. You know, I feel like it's the same thing. And like, everyone's being the critical kind of resistance classes, but like, how come no one took an active part in resistance before this or to engage in the struggle? So from a teaching perspective in England or in a Scandinavian country, I had that same feeling of just kind of, you know, the boxes are checked, but somehow it's still the same. But yeah, in terms of research, yeah, and maybe even speaking to the last point, you know, in terms of actually, like I described in the last section, that I feel like a lot of my work creates new bureaucratic kind of things and hoops to go through to create more kind of box checks to encourage participation, sustain things, you know, was it education, sustainability, participation. I mean, these are all in military manuals as ways to actually sustain occupation. And go look at a counterinsurgency manual. You're going to see a model for occupation that uses all these same buzzwords in development. And I work at a development institute, which I still am. But I mean, I would just say this is a code word for neocolonialism. But I guess kind of speaking to the point on ecocide, you know, when things are usually even things that one wants to see brought in and to be fought against, you know, the same way Hillary Clinton used LGBTQ rights as a way to justify invading Iraq or Afghanistan, I actually worry the same problem is going to happen with ecocide. And I work in genocide studies. You know, I worry that genocide's the new reason to justify something, and then all the climate youth who never cared about all the different indigenous and radical environmental struggles before them will be clapping because of different social media algorithms and so on and so forth. Again, maybe a bit cynical what I'm saying. But yeah, so I mean, I'm not so hopeful, but at the same time, you know, I've done everything in my power to produce knowledge that can help people defend their territories, defend their habitats. I've tried to make those things open access. I give endless amounts of talks for free and squats, social centers in different places like this to encourage its outreach, to have those conversations, to hopefully, yeah, to give people the tools that they need to kind of do what they need to do. But at the same time, it feels rather limited. I'm not particularly happy about it. I'm kind of at the point where I feel that universities are an obstruction to social change more than they are spaces for them, even though that's very ironic, right? These are the spaces we're supposed to have deep ideas and have good conversations, but somehow we turn into bureaucratic student pushers, graders, fighting for grants, all the things Thema told us about, which are horrendous. You know, I've never even gotten a huge grant. You know, I've actually been blocked through personal conflicts. They just blocked me despite matching all the metrics and everything times 10 and teaching impact and all this. They just wouldn't let me do it for, again, there's a whole process undergoing for this, you know, but we can do what we can, you know, we got our obligations to ourselves, to our friends, to our hearts, and we got to do what we are within these institutions and where we stand. And but I guess for researchers, I think there's the big thing is, you know, are we always kind of placing ourselves outside the conflict? Are we looking at the world through the linear vision, I guess they call it, through the window, turning things into petri dishes? Or are we actually really remembering we are in that petri dish and we're not separate, even if we can get a plane out of there sometimes? And, you know, this really comes into a relational conversation. And I guess behind every conversation is our politics and our vision and what we want to have there, and you know, what we're going to do and what that means. And yeah, I think there's space for universities and researchers to really help to create and widen space inside and outside universities and to really make social change. But what is social change? What is diversity? What are the politics you're trying to create? You know, are rather serious. What are radical? You know, what's the word radical actually mean? What's this code for? So it's, yeah, I think these definitions matter in terms of actually the visions people want to create. And hopefully there'll be more space for people to breathe and to have unmediated actions. And for me, I guess behind everything I do is I want to see increased qualities of relationships amongst people, with trees, with rivers, with our surroundings, so we can really actually get towards something that's actually socially and ecologically renewable, and not this crazy garbage that's being sold to us constantly and being justified through these different models and epistemologies and ethnography as well, that is just really just inundated with these kind of subjectivities that are really just trying to hold on to a job and just speak the party line, or to just be critical, but critical in a way that is so painfully accepted and just creates a new kind of hoop to jump through. But okay, with that, thanks so much everyone for all the amazing comments and the concerns. It's really, that's actually one of the nicer things.
Thank you, Alexander. I think both you and Amer have raised an important point about how it's not just resistance that evidence potentially needs to contribute to at the moment. It's actually questions of survival and defense of some kind of way of life. So with that, over to Thema for the last contribution of this last round.
All right. Yes. Thank you all again. Ditto all the amazing, thoughtful comments. And I love this panel. This has been so far just a really lot of fun. I would say I'm semi-hopeful because I have this tendency to look back. So when I look into historical evidence, right, historical trends, I've seen resistance take place in ways that actually make serious, real change for people in their lives. And so if I lean on that, it gives me something to say, this is not all in vain, and that there's some hope. In some of my work, I am primarily a quantitative researcher, although I do adopt mixed methods. And because of that, and those of you familiar, right, the quantitative world has been very hesitant on positionality, critical approaches, critical lenses, and there are things, but that's changing. And that's changing. I'm not going to try to attribute why, but people like myself who approach their work critically and the underlying meaning of data, right? What does data mean? And how is it being used? And the acknowledgement of these power structures that envelop all of our lives, including our scientific lives and our theorizing and our perspectives, right? All of that are starting to find ways to carve out space to experiment with marrying these two approaches, right? Marrying these very quantitative, big data, AI, which we can have a whole nother session just on these movements there, and critical approaches. And so one of the approaches I've termed is emancipatory data science. And so that in that emancipatory framing, what we're doing is saying we're centering the voices of those marginalized, centering the experiences and the logics of those marginalized. And in fact, part of that change, this gets to the people part of it, is getting more people from these marginalized communities, including not just the elitist few of us. And I'm saying us because I think we recognize, right, reflects that we are a part of the elite in that again, that ability to be reflexive. And particularly to Linsey's point earlier, right, we're a part of that body. So saying, I know my background, I know where I came from. Yes, very privileged. I know I come from a very privileged background. Within that, though, of course, there are different structures and other elements that you bump up against in that journey. But centering the data and voices of those most marginalized to theorize a perspective on the world and working collaboratively, some of the participatory work, I'm feeling like some of the work that you're doing speaks to this, right? Really being in partnership and collaboration with community and using that. And your point is well taken. Research does not just come from insights, impact does not just come from the ivory tower, right? And how do we embrace that? Those of us who are in positions of modest to moderate power can create space, right, to envelop and bring up those who are doing that good work, and we can amplify it. So acts of resistance are happening everywhere, even in academia. And so, and I'll just use my very odd case as an example to the other point about this perceived prestige, right? So again, in the US context, we have Howard. I'm a graduate of Howard University. I'm sorry, I was talking about Harvard earlier. Howard University is a historically Black college university in the United States in Washington, D.C. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. I went to Howard after leaving another prestigious, very Ivy. And I left that Ivy precisely because I was protesting the tax on my mental health and labor. I was in constant protests. I had to, it was exhausting. And okay, while I appreciate the experience there, I was like, I just came here to study psychology. I was a psychology major way back in the day. But in that shift, I saw both worlds, right? And as an undergraduate, the uplift and the support that I received at my historically Black college, which was underappreciated, undervalued. Now there's a smidgen of respect that's given to HBCUs because of the lift that they've been doing for the country. But really, they're like, oh, how could you leave? I'm not going to name the other institution. How could you leave? Oh my gosh, what are you doing? There was this idea that I had lost my mind to give up, right? This very prestigious elite undergraduate institution for a Howard University. Now, I explained it away. I said, oh, I'll go to grad school and I'll make up for it there and I'll be this and that. And I'm like, this game that we have to play, right? To pedal to these norms and the assumption that you're right, Linsey, the assumption that Harvard is the best because it's Harvard. It creates this circular logic, which is very dangerous because when they do say things that are ignorant and wrong, and I have seen grants come through, again, I've seen it because I'm a reviewer for a lot of these NSF grants. I'm looking at them and I'm saying, oh, no. And again, but if you're not there to say no, everyone will be like, oh, it must be great. So I think there are acts of resistance, citing marginalized, minoritized. That means that you have to know, right, where to look for that research and that scholarship. Don't be afraid to do that. A lot of the times what I do is I publish in outlets that are just open access, period, just to get my work out there. I'm an assistant professor. I still have to gain tenure. A lot of people are like, you're being pretty, be careful now. Like, what are you doing? But again, I have to embrace the fullness of who I am at this point and show that to the world and even be an example to those scholars who are coming up in the ranks, right? Doctoral students and the like, who are looking for ways to say, I can be my full self in the scholarly space. If we don't do that and show them as an example, then they're going to leave and they're not going to be in this ivory tower space at all. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Thema, and thank you to all of our amazing speakers for their contributions in this third round. So much to think with here. I'm having like a full nerd attack of joy listening to all of you. I'm going to hand over to Anna to wrap up, and we will give everyone a chance. Well, not everyone, we're not going to have time for everyone to say something, but if anyone wants to chip in, add a comment, say a question, please do. Your time comes now. Over to you, Anna.
Great. Yes, thank you. It's so rich, and I have to admit, when Mehita first pitched this idea to me, I wasn't fully convinced, and I'm so glad that, like most of Mehita's ideas, I just say yes because this was so rich, and I really appreciate you all not just taking the time to be here now, but clearly having taken the time to reflect on these questions and to be so candid with us and so open. And I think echoing what Thema was just saying about, if these spaces aren't made and we don't talk openly, then how can we continue any of these conversations? So I just have two, they're going to be observations because they're massive as questions. So they're just kind of statements, and they're just going to echo things that people said, but just So I guess the two, and these are also, I am like, for my sins, always trying to be optimistic. So these are both kind of optimistically framed, though I was very grateful for the less optimistic sharing that occurred today. So the first is, I think it would be great to all be sharing more examples of studies and research projects, and whether inside or outside of academia, that are doing really innovative things, combining quant and qual methods and participatory research of some kind, whether that's through like the ways it's done in medical research, where groups work with you. We call it PPI, I don't know, it's always called that. Or if it's through kind of co-production, co-creation, or whether it's through, working with community organizations. So like what are actual, like, and we don't have to answer this, but if anyone knows of their favorite and wants to share it in the chat, I think it would be great to start kind of pulling some of these out and bringing them together as one of the things this series can contribute. And then the other, I think, as we ended on the last few speakers in particular, this idea of navigating those tensions between producing university and government validated knowledge, whether it's because we're applying for funding or because we're trying to publish in journals, and whether that's because we need job stability and we're going for promotion, or whether that's because we want bigger funds to be able to do bigger kinds of research, or to have higher levels of influence. So that whole world that we in our jobs have to navigate, versus amplifying, co-producing, outside of university, which has now, I think, in a way that is quite complex, been a bit co-opted as public engagement and research impact within the university itself. So I think probably all of us here on the panel are the types of people who were doing this before we could actually count it towards our jobs. And so we're now in this strange world where all of these things that we used to do and people thought were like, maybe cute if we were lucky, and otherwise distracting or annoying if we were not as lucky, are now actually things that we can put into our applications. And that's a very strange but opening, I think, time that we are in, just to echo what the panelists are saying. So I guess that's the other thing I'm left with thinking about is, particularly in thinking about younger generations of scholars and scholars coming up now, or people not sure if they should get involved in academia, or if that's not the right place for the kinds of things that they want to do or change or make. How do we kind of approach this world that we're in? Okay, so those are my what we called pithy observations that I was responsible for. So I will now will take some of the questions in the audience, and what I might do is just kind of stack them, and then we can go to each of the panelists and they can kind of pick and choose what to pull out. So I'll take a couple now. I'd like to go to the one that came, where are my notes? That came in from Claire Lewis, which is, I think, a little bit of a comment. I'm not sure if you're still here, Claire. If you are and want to just ping us if you are. So she said, I work for the UK government, FCDO, and we're launching research calls on environmental degradation, aiming to be interdisciplinary and locally led to avoid some of these issues being flagged. But would love to hear thoughts from the panel on how we can do better when funding research, noting the power structures inevitably baked into that dynamic that can't be escaped but should be noted. So I think that's a really nice kind of concrete question that came in. And I'm not sure, I haven't pulled any of the other ones from the chat. So the other point that I have from the chat from earlier was about kind of echoing some of these things we were talking about how institutions and embedded privilege. So the point that most research in Western countries is only representative of those countries, but nevertheless makes universal claims. This also happens in the humanities and was highlighted by today's accusation of Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa against Oxford University's Reuters Institute of Study and Journalism. I just think that's really important, that we tend to kind of act as if these problems are so much bigger in the social science, in the hard sciences first, then the social sciences, and then, but the humanities is where all the critical, rebellion occurs. But I think that's probably a detrimental way of thinking for advancing these things. So I think that's an important point. And sorry, that was from, apologies if I say this wrong, Wario Alfonso Luga Ocando. So apologies for butchering that. If you are here and either of you want to come in on the chat, just let us know. And Mehita, did you catch any other questions that
I didn't. I think you caught them all. We've had a rather silent group of participants, but perhaps that's just because they've been so wowed by the amazing contributions. Gyro's here. Gyro, do you want to come in and make a comment in your own voice? We can enable that if you'd like. He can't open the camera.
I can fix that.
Can you? Thank you.
I just have to find you. So we might want to do this.
Yeah.
Come back to it while
I think I can do it. Wait, let me figure it out. Maybe Fumani can also help us.
I see you.
Yeah.
All right. That should be. Oh, I was going to turn it off for everyone. I will do that now in the back.
I think you can turn it off for everyone. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Gyro.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a fantastic panel. I've been really oh, we should like this. And so it's very exciting also to hear all the discussions of the round table. I don't know if you all saw today that there's a big news on The Guardian today in the UK. The Nobel Prize winner for journalism made a huge criticism of the Reuters Journalism Institute about their study on digital news. And I think this criticism really reflects a lot of the issues that we've been talking about here, particularly in relation to how you are allowed when you do a study in Britain or the United States and you cite CNN or BBC and then you say, oh, this is the way media does things. Like you tend to make universal claims that actually in reality are not applicable. And I think at the center of the problem of diversity and recognition and in all areas of social science, humanities, but also natural science is this tendency to see who is in power and who controls this. And there's a group of people in the University of Granada in Spain who've done a lot of research about metrics and power. And the work is really fascinating because, for example, some of the things I can cite you, scholars in the US, and please don't quote me on that because I can't remember exact numbers, but it's something like between 60 to 70% of the intra-references and citations that US scholars make are inside the US. So if you go through the majority of papers in areas like medicine, physics, astronomy, etc., the most of the citations they do is from scholars in the US. Meanwhile, you go to places like South Africa, Venezuela, Colombia, wherever you go, and it's completely the reverse. We tend to cite them a lot. And, part of that, of course, is the English language, but a lot of that is what Apapuri called the fear of small number. I'm still citing Apapuri despite the scandal, but and this atavistic complex that seems that unless it comes from certain universities or centers of power, it's worth citing, and if not, it's not worth citing. And of course, language is also a career. We are all, at least here in the Middle East, we are all chained as slaves for this notion of Scopus, and we have to if you don't publish in Scopus, which you don't get, and we're completely bound by that for contractual reasons or etc. So there's, I think at the center is the issue of power, and that is in fact the reason why we have so little diversity in research in all areas, not only, by the way, in social science, humanity, which of course happens far more, but also even in natural science. And several studies about citations and metrics over and over again underlines the fact that certain academia is so powerful that gets cited a lot, and it, in many cases, has nothing. I do get it that quantitative research is far more costly, but it's in all areas, even in areas where you work with qualitative research. And of course, like in our area, media and media and communication studies, there's a group of probably 25 to 30 journals that hold power. And also, and the same applies for conferences. You go to conferences like ICA or IMCR, and in our area, or AGMC. I mean, AGMC is basically US-led. You see absolutely almost zero diversity in AGMC, and nonetheless, their journals, their publications are the most cited. So, there is a real absence of Global South voices in this. And again, it's not only in humanities and social science, but even in natural science. So I think that's today's story about the Reuters Institute. It's really, really reflective of this problem. It's not only that the study is not comprehensive and encompasses, and actually in some cases put in danger the journalists, but also this universal claims that comes from this type of studies, and then it becomes a paradigm for all of us, in which we have to follow this type of theories. And I have fights with my faculty all the time because I need to apply this theory. No, you don't. Actually, they have nothing to do with your context in the Arab world, but nonetheless, they themselves are very bound, feel very obliged, and says, Professor, but if I don't cite this, I don't get published. And I say, well, but the fight is fighting. So I'll leave it there.
Anna, you're on mute in case you were trying to say something.
Oh, no. So we were just, I forgot whether you were or I were hosting the Q&A. It's
you.
Okay. So just if there's nothing else that's come in from the audience on top of those, so what we'd like to do is just give a chance for the speakers to, if they have any final or last thoughts or anything they'd like to say before we wrap up. So just a short final thought. So Laila, anything from you?
I guess I'm still trying to be cautiously optimistic about the way forward. And seminars like this is what keeps things going, and certainly keeps my optimism going, without being completely eyes wide open to what's actually happening at an institutional level and at a global level and at a community level within my field. So thank you.
Great. And Linsey?
Yeah, this might be paradoxical because I wish I was a more optimistic person, but I strongly feel that optimistic language is the way to go to create political change. And on that point, I love Thema's title of one of her papers, Emancipatory Data Science. I think for too long, progressives have been seeding this sort of space of positive, inspiring language to more reactionary forces, like the right's capture of the use of the word freedom in recent years, because I think that increasingly we are overly reliant on a language of negativity and abolition used far too elastically to too many fields that can possibly be useful in order to create change, because it creates so much fear in the minds of different constituents who see funding flows being abolished, who see potential social protections being abolished. So I think a language of emancipation, to me, gives me hope. And I'm really excited to read this piece that was shared on ResearchGate. And I think Thema's point about citation politics could not be more important moving forward, because that is almost the easiest fix to create great change, in my view. And if we can be teaching students that at the very least, then we're on a positive trajectory. So I loved this panel. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Linsey. Amer? Oh, I think we might have
I muted myself. I don't really have much to add at this point. I mean, I think for me personally, in the work that I do, and especially as well as what's been said today, the thing that I keep continually emphasizing is that slogan, nothing about us without us. And I think it's really, really important to kind of hold that close to our hearts in all of this, because, you know, as everybody kind of says, we have such a small view of what is actually going on in the world. You know, there are so many things that we have no idea about, and it's, you know, we can't know. But I mean, there does have to be trust and faith that particularly, you know, people will do everything that they can to ensure their own survival, you know, and more than that, their own like thriving as well, you know. And so I think by holding on to that kind of idea that people are doing all of these things, and we just might not know about it, or it might just not be beneficial for us to know, or, you know, a whole range of other things, that doesn't mean that those things, those emancipatory things, those self-determined things, those liberatory things aren't happening all the time, you know. And I think that's something really, really important to note, that we just have a very small view of the world, and that it's always going to be limited, and we can just try to amplify those things as much as possible and turn towards them.
Great. Thank you so much. Alexander?
Yeah, on my end, I'm kind of with Amer, that you never know the future. There's a lot of things going on, and I would kind of, if I was to take a positive kind of angle, I would put my eggs in that basket, in terms of that you never really know everything that's going on. Time spans are longer and shorter and things like this. But I think there are real issues in terms of how, not only how people treat each other, but really the constant and systemic extractivism that is worsening by the day, in terms of how water, minerals, and how they're being dug up, and specifically really with how people are talking about new green technologies and pretend they don't come from these enormous mining chemical supply chains and things like this. So, but yeah, I just, it's been great actually to hear about people's research and what's going on, and to see very different people and things from where I'm normally reading, and yeah, different topics. I'm hearing more from STEM and psychology, so this is good. But everyone, thank you so much. Anna, everyone, appreciate it.
Great, thank you. And Thema?
Yes, just echo the positive feedback for the organizers. Mehita and Anna, this has been a lovely panel. I didn't quite know what to expect, and I can't wait to dig into the synthesis of this work, because I think there's something that we absolutely need to share with the world, and put a stamp on the points that were made here today. So kudos and thank you.
Great. So just back to Mehita to close this up.
Thank you. I just wanted to say a last word of thanks on behalf of both myself and Anna, and the 2 research centers and institutions that we represent, which feels strange to say after the deep and critical dive we've taken into thinking about power and how it operates through knowledge construction and knowledge making. But I think the one thought I wanted to finish on, and I guess this is an ongoing conversation that we need to have, is that I think all forms of science are structures of communication, right? Are practices of communication, and are all completely embedded both within, of course, structures and histories of power, but also in different like modalities of defining what evidence is. So for me, the question of science communication is really at the heart of all kind of ontologies, if you like, of what research is and what knowledge creation is. And I really hope that we can build this roundtable series into an ongoing exploration of the kind of meta-theoretical, epistemological questions that are attendant to the research that we do. And it's been such a brilliant, I think, first step towards that. And just a huge thank you to all of the brilliant experts who trusted us with this kind of experimental idea, and for helping us to prove the point, I think, that we have to keep having conversations like this, and for them to be formalized, and for them to keep going. So everyone who attended, thank you for attending. Watch the space, stay in touch, and we will have another one at some point that we will announce. And you can stay in touch with all of our work, both of our centers, both Anna's and mine, at these links on social media. So I think thank you so much to Laila, to Linsey, to Thema, to Alexander, to Amer, and to Anna, and to Fumani behind the scenes, who brought us all together.
Thank you.
Thank you all.